Hey there, and welcome to another edition of Deep Dive. I'm Amy.
And I'm Shane.
And today we are going to be talking about making room for hope. This is Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. This is what Isaiah, Amoz' son, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of the mountains. It will be lifted above the hills. Peoples will stream to it. Many nations will go and say, "Come, let's go up to the Lord's mountain, to the house of Jacob's God, so that he may teach us his ways, and we may walk in God's paths." Instruction will come from Zion, the Lord's word from Jerusalem. God will judge between the nations and settle disputes of mighty nations. Then they will beat their swords into iron plows and their spears into pruning tools. Nation will not take up sword against nation. They will no longer learn how to make war. Come, house of Jacob, let's walk by the Lord's light. All right, so we are in Advent.
Hooray!
Woo! And we have just started a new sermon series to go along with Advent because, of course, we think about hope, peace, joy, and love. And then
in various orders, which many, many years into ministry, I still can't remember the exact order because churches do it different sometimes.
It is hope, peace, joy, and love.
Then it is for this series, correct? Yes.
So the sermon series, though, we're talking about making room, which I think is really interesting because a lot of times I might think of that kind of terminology more for Lent, perhaps, than for Advent.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could talk about the series just a little bit.
Yeah, I think the Lent comparison is apt. I mean, it's commonly said in the church, we'll call Advent Little Lent because the themes are the same. It's certainly shorter. It's certainly, how should you say, a little more brighter and enjoyable than Lent, which Lent can sometimes feel like a dirge. But I think in the best case for both, it's a series of introspection. What you're waiting for at the end of each is a little different, but they're shades of each other. So, I've always preferred it as a time of introspection. Now, as someone who works in a church, the introspection often comes because it's super stressful, and we're extra busy, all these sort of extra things, and then you have all the family extra things. I mentioned in the sermon, we've already done 2 Christmas things, 2 big go visit Christmas things, and we've not even started the parties yet. Right. So, the introspection, I think sometimes comes, it's a crucible, because you're so busy. At some point, you'd go, what do I want my life to be like? And that sometimes happens for better, for worse in Advent. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed in the sermon is kind of this thread of talking about even like the definition of hope, kind of talking about this kind of original idea of hope. It's like the expectation kind of either way, and then...
There's a book I mentioned in the sermon called Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright, which was a really important book to me years ago. What's interesting is, what's the name of the Rob Bell book that he got all the flack for?
Was it Love Wins?
Yeah, Love Wins. And it's funny, if you've ever read Love Wins, I often joke with people, if you've read that book, that it's essentially like a Reader's Digest version of N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, which establishes this sort of, frankly, eschatology in times, what's actually happening in the faith. And, N.T. Wright, he literally means it, that if we believe these things, we will be surprised by hope. And so hope has always been an important word to me. And it's interesting. I just thought, you know what? Because we're zeroing in on these words, hope, peace. Right. It would be helpful to look at the words. So, as I started doing a lot of reading in that last week, I remembered the Greek word elpis, but I didn't necessarily remember any of the context for it because we just often think of translations as being one to one. This word means this, but when we study, it's not that. It's much more complicated. And so, It is interesting in that Greco-Roman sense that it just means an expectation of the future, which is fascinating because it can be good or it can be bad, but it can't be neutral. You can have bad expectations, good expectations, but you can't have neutral expectations if you're going to use that word elpis, which is really interesting. So one of the things the Theological Dictionary was talking about is that word often, for a Christian sense, always became synonymous with the word agape. And I thought that was, to me, I thought that was one of the more powerful things I read, that eventually we just dropped the agape, but those words sort of, it was almost like this portmanteau. It got merged into one thing. And I use the phrase, an expectation of a love-filled future. And I thought that was really interesting. It's interesting to compare it also to things like the rabbinical tradition, which doesn't really even have a word for hope. The closest thing they could come up with is this idea of a messianic expectation, but in that, there's some responsibility we have on earth within a rabbinic tradition to sort of set the table for Messiah. And so it's not this God-filled thing. If you go back further into the more of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament traditions, there is a greater sense of hope. You see it in the Psalms. You even see it in Job in this sort of funny, twisted way. I thought of Job a lot when writing this because Job clearly had some sort of hope, but it was weird. It wasn't necessarily in God's justice. It was more just in justice is going to happen. It's an interesting thing. But I find that really fruitful because it is Christianity taking this word, but really making it their own. And I make the case in the sermon that I think hope is the defining word of Christianity. I think I'd love to have more insight than that, but I feel like I'm even wrestling with understanding what that means. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, so even from that point on, then I think you move to talking about how perhaps our cynicism, what some might call realism or pragmatism, can get in the way of really fully experiencing that kind of hope ourselves.
Yeah, I mentioned there was a podcast I listened to probably about a year ago. It was the Ezra Klein podcast. He was interviewing Brene Brown, and they were talking about, she was talking about hope as this cognitive behavioral sequence, but what was more interesting, she was talking about, to bring Rob Bell up again, his definition of despair. It's believing tomorrow will be the same as today. Some theological writers would maybe define it a little different. They'd say believing that tomorrow will be the same as yesterday. Maybe they view that today is not as fixed, but I don't know if there's much in that. But I don't know. I think that's really interesting because the cynic, I think the cynic would say, well, if tomorrow is going to be the same as today, it's up to me to make it better. And I think that gives us this sort of carte blanche to behave in all sorts of like unethical, destructive ways that don't bring about wholeness. I'm not saying we should do nothing. I want to be really clear about that. But if our hope is this externalized, that God in God's love will ultimately win, it means our focus is more on perseverance and patience and waiting. I didn't hit on that a lot in the sermon, but a lot of the authors I was reading was basically saying hope is synonymous with waiting. It's this foretaste of the future, this joy, this sense of presence that we have now, even though God has not fully arrived. And so I just don't think cynicism can coexist with that. And I can be a cynical person. And, so much, I know we're coming out of that a little bit as a culture. We're still cynical as a culture, but from our entertainment perspective. A lot of our movies now tend to be a little more earnest, whereas in the 90s, they had a little more of a cynical edge to it. Maybe that's just a generational difference between Gen X and millennials and Gen Z. I don't know. But I do think that is a good thing because I have a hard time seeing hope and cynicism coexisting. One of my favorite comedians is Conan O'Brien, and maybe that's just because he's completely absurd and ridiculous. But when he went through this whole process where he got fired, his dream was to host The Tonight Show. He ultimately gets The Tonight Show after Jay Leno, host it for like a year and a half, something like that, not very long, and ends up getting fired. And in that, he could have had this enormous cynical response. And in his final farewell monologue, he literally said to avoid cynicism because it corrodes the soul. And I think that's an interesting example of someone who found joy in the midst of joy and hope in the midst of suffering. For him, it's he's doing fine. But he lost his dream. I always thought that was interesting. So that's where I really keyed in on that. Yeah.
So picking back up on that Rob Bell, the despair piece of that, as we move into Advent, you've mentioned in the sermon that this is a time of year that can be difficult for people. And I think just saying to get rid of the despair or like move it out. We're talking about making room. How do you do that? And you said in the sermon, that's going to be different for everyone and, at different levels. But I mean, just how do you do that?
Yeah, it's like every one of our tendencies that can get to us all arrive, like nostalgia. Nostalgia can be, I generally feel nostalgia is not helpful. So this is a season of nostalgia. Look back at the better times, and now we think, oh, now's not as good. And then so the idealing that comes with that. There's a notion of the fear of missing out. And so you pull up social media or whatever, and you see a million people smiling happy at Friendsgivings, Thanksgivings, Christmases. There's like all these things are arriving at one. Everyone's acting happy, or at least faking acting happy, and it's like, I don't know, it's so isolated. It can make you feel like in this world, like, am I the only one who's suffering? Where if we actually stop and think about it, we realize that's not true. But it's definitely a season for that. I feel fortunate that that's not necessarily a part of my life, but I have enough, friends and family members that go through that I'm sensitive to that. That's why in the past in previous churches, I'd conducted a blue Christmas service to honor that sort of suffering. There's a wonderful thing about this, our life has this rhythm to it, and that we repeat these events within the Christian tradition. We're following the Christian calendar that allows us to walk with Jesus, and it makes these things sink in. But the flip side of that is it creates, essentially, these choke points where we remember previous times. And I think we have to be sensitive to that in the way we plan worship, just to be aware that, like, we can't go around expecting everyone to think this is the most wonderful time of the year.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to maybe touch on a little more here is, like, I don't like getting in the business of telling people how to heal from grief.
Sure, yeah.
Because it's often different from other people, every person. I do think there's some commonalities. I think, it requires community. It requires certainly a feeling of belonging and trust where you can discuss those things, work out those things, find new purposes. But I wanted to be clear that I don't expect people. I do think despair crowds out hope, but I think we don't necessarily have to clear out the despair to have hope. I think sometimes even
that's a good point.
I think sometimes even getting taste of that hope helps with the clearing out. Maybe and even in the case of despair, it's not like we ever get over these things. We just learn to live with them differently. And so instead of, I use the analogy of a messy room, maybe full of scars and knickknacks, instead, we know how to repurpose those things, to use the analogy of our homes. We know how to repurpose those things as decorations in our life that, now are sweet, bittersweet memories, to not to make every parent out there cry, but it in many ways, it's sort of the lesson of Inside Out, learning to have these complex emotions with these previous events. And so that I think that's the point I want to get to with despair. We should not feel ashamed of feeling despair, but I do think it's important to remind people of the promise that your future is, destined by God to be filled with love. And that's a promise, whether we believe it today or not, it's worth hearing. Yeah.
And I think that's so important too, just for people to remember that this season can be complicated for people. And so how we are in community with one another and how we treat others is particularly important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Now's the time in our podcast where we talk about things we'd encourage you to dive deeper into, things we think you might enjoy or learn from. And so, Amy, do you like to go first?
Sure. So this is ridiculous.
Okay.
So on Hulu, there is a show, it's a Christmas show, and it is called Rap Battle. Have you seen this?
No.
You must go home today.
Is it just people wrapping presents?
Yes. It's a competition. And it gets so serious. People are crying. They're getting in fights. It is absurd. And I watched all 4 episodes that are up just last night.
Oh my.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that if you're sitting there with somebody, you're going to be hitting them saying, what is going on right now?
Wow. So it's like a train wreck of sorts. Yeah.
Yeah. And this just band of characters that they have on this show is just impeccable.
I'm really into, I don't know if you've seen on Netflix, Nailed It, which is it's like a cooking show, but none of the people are good cooks.
Right.
And they're making them do the most ridiculous things. And what I enjoy about it is like, it's not a cynical show because like everyone there realizes they can't really do it. And so it's like this mutual, let's all laugh at each other. This sounds like this is fierce.
These are people who take wrapping presents to another level. It actually made me get on Pinterest and think,
oh no,
do I need to be wrapping presents in a more fancy way?
Oh no. This is a dangerous recommendation.
It is, but it's also hilarious.
I will recommend something that I just found out a couple days ago. It's a podcast called The Promise. It's of significance to us here in Nashville because it's about the Casey houses, the Casey homes, which is a project in East Nashville that the city's undergoing this enormous process of revitalizing that area to make it mixed income. It's also important to us because we're a Presbyterian church and we have supported in the past and continue to support an organization called the Martha O'Brien Center, which exists right there on the campus of that. And it's it's done by Nashville Public Radio. It's just called The Promise. I can't remember how many parts it is, but it's really, really interesting. They're right in the middle of recording their second season right now. It's not actually been released yet, but it's a really interesting podcast of issues of race, of policing, of public housing, of what it's like to live in a city that's booming, that we experience every day as we hop in our cars and try to get home. So I would commend that to you. As always, if you want to listen to the sermon, it's down there in the show notes, a link. You can watch it. You can see my mug up there preaching, or you can listen to the audio version of it. Like, subscribe, all those sort of things, and we'll see you next week on Deep Dive. See you.
Bye-bye.